Welcome, everyone. We're really excited you're here for the new season of the High Elevation 5-Needle White Pines Science and Management webinar series. I want to thank everyone who participated in the series last year. Welcome those of you who are new to our community. This webinar series is hosted by the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, which is a nonprofit, science-based organization that's dedicated to the restoration and conservation of whitebark, as well as other high elevation white pines in Western North America. If you are not yet a member, we really hope you'll consider joining to support programming like our webinar series, and there'll be information in the chat in a couple of minutes with links to the Foundation's website and information on how you can join. So this webinar series is an opportunity to share information as well as to network with others in our community. There are rotating speakers each month. The series, importantly, is hosted by 3 individuals who are here today, and I want to start by thanking each of them because they worked last year as the webinar hosts, and we're so grateful that they're joining again this year to serve as our MCs throughout the academic year when the webinars are run. They include Karina Lee from University of Colorado, Denver, Enzo Martelli from University of Montana, and Lou Deloise from Montana State University. So thanks to all of you, and you'll be hearing from these individuals each month. You're also going to hear from a staff or board member of the foundation just very briefly at the start of each webinar so that you get some details about the programming that the foundation is doing. And so I'm going to kick us off with this month's information on the foundation and turn it over to Julie Shamhart for information about our conference.
Thanks so much, Kara, and thanks to the webinar team and to Kara for all the work you guys have done planning the webinar. And Kara's been doing for 3 years now. And thanks for all the attendees also for being here every month or as often as you can. So I wanted to take a moment to mention our conference. We have an annual conference. It's held in a different location each year. And this year, our conference is going to be in Bozeman, Montana. It is from October 7th to the 9th. That is a Tuesday to Thursday. And it is hosted by Danielle Ulrich this year and a team of conference hosts. From several agencies, the National Park Service, the Forest Service, and the BLM are all have folks on our conference committee this year. And it is co-hosted by the Montana State University. Danielle's at Montana State University. And it's going to be held on campus there at MSU. And there's also a virtual option. So if you're not able to make it to Bozeman to travel this year, you can register on our website to sign up for the virtual option, and you'll be able to watch the presentations on Wednesday. We have presentations, just like for the webinar, we have presentations on both research and management. We have US and a couple of Canadian presenters this year. We try to have both US and Canadian presenters, but obviously it's harder to travel from further away. So excited about that. And like every year, we have a field trip this year. We're going to go to Little Bear Seed Orchard. It's right outside Bozeman. It's right outside Bozeman. It's a little bit of a drive, but we're excited to get up to the seed orchard and see the work that they're doing up there. It's a Forest Service seed orchard. And so we're going to be touring there and learning about also some inventory and monitoring from National Park Service folks. And we also have an exciting community event this year we're having on the first night of the conference that we're going to have some nationally and Montana recognized conservation leaders and storytellers, journalists as panelists. And those include Hal Herring, Joe Josephson, and Hillary Eisen, and possibly another person. We're still nailing it all down, but that should be fun. And then our regular conference events, we always have a conference social where folks can network, and a silent auction where we raise money for our student grant. And so excited about the conference. I will drop a link in the chat here in a few minutes, and always welcome questions, and you can send me an email or check out our website. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks so much, Kara, also for your really nice words at the beginning. All right, so for today, if you missed any of our previous installments, you can find the recordings of the talks on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks. The link to our website will be posted in the chat in the following minutes. And finally, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments, doubts, and questions. Please post them on the chat box, and our team will be collecting them throughout. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Laurel Sindewald. Laurel is a postdoctoral fellow affiliated with the Missoula Fire Science Lab. She's currently using the Large Fire Simulator and the Forest Vegetation Simulator to estimate smoke and emission trade-offs between prescribed fire management scenarios in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. Laurel earned her PhD in the Integrative and System Biology at the University of Colorado, Denver in Diana Tombach's Forest Ecology Lab, like Karina, where she studied limber pine at treeline in the Rocky Mtns National Park. And with that, I'm really happy to turn it over to Laurel.
Thanks so much, Enzo. Hi, everyone. I'm Laurel. Lately, I've been doing wildfire simulation modeling, but today I'm here to talk to you about some of my dissertation research. So here, I'll give you something more interesting to stare at than just my face. Can you see that?
It's loading on our end, and now it's fine.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So in a past webinar, I presented my work using multispectral satellite imagery to identify limber pine and treeline communities. We now have a paper under review in Biogeosciences from that work titled Identifying Alpine Treeline Species Using High-Resolution Worldview 3 Multispectral Imagery and Convolutional Neural Networks. Here's a link to the webinar previously and the preprint for that paper. You may have also caught this Nutcracker Notes article on my work with folks in RMNP, Rocky Mount National Park, to raise limber pine seedlings for restoration planting in the Cameron Peak burn scar, a sort of bonus result of my work to estimate limber pine seed viability across elevations. So here's a link to Nutcracker Notes. You have to be a member to get this latest one, but it's always worth it. Okay. So all of these projects were aimed at the overarching question of how limber pine is likely to respond to changing climate in treeline communities, and what this will mean for treeline advance in the Southern Rocky Mountains. So you're likely familiar with limber pine. Limber pine is an ecologically important conifer found from the southwestern US into Alberta, Canada. It provides nutritionally dense seeds that are an important food source for bears, birds, rodents, and foxes. Limber pine also colonizes disturbed areas, including post-fire, but as a long-lived, slow-growing species, it tends to be outcompeted by faster-growing conifers at mesic sites. Limber pine's primary mode of dispersal is zoochoric. So our favorite, the Clark's nutcracker, which harvests seeds from cones and makes caches across the landscape as winter and spring food stores. Incidentally, nutcrackers tend to cache near objects that help birds remember cache sites, but which may also result in facilitative benefits, especially above treeline. And treeline caching has been observed. Meanwhile, limber pine has adaptations that allow it to grow in most places the Clark nutcracker caches it. For example, limber pine can tolerate extremely windy conditions, and its large seeds provide more resources for early development of a taproot that provides stability and access to deeper water resources, which has been confirmed with stable oxygen isotope analyses of mature limber pine trees. The pine can also grow on a wide variety of soil types and parent materials, and can associate with as many as 15 ectomycorrhizal fungal species. A study of ectomycorrhizal fungi on roots of limber pine and Great Basin bristlecone pine seedlings in the ATE, the alpine treeline ecotone, showed that limber pine associated with more species and roots were more densely colonized than bristlecone pine seedlings. Finally, limber pine can leverage early snowmelt with higher rates of photosynthesis supported by high stomatal density in its needles, and then the pine slows its photosynthetic rate in the summer when evaporative demand is high, before increasing rates again in the fall. Limber pine's drought tolerance could come in handy at treeline as temperatures warm and snow melts off earlier. So if you're not familiar with bioclimatic envelope modeling, it's the practice of estimating the range of biologically relevant climate variables associated with a species' current range and projecting where that envelope of climate conditions will shift spatially under climate change projections. So Monahan et al. Developed bioclimatic envelope models for limber pine in Rocky Mount National Park and determined that limber pine's distribution would shrink at lower elevations and that it would migrate to higher elevations. The results are supported by paleobotanical studies of pollen in lake sediment cores, which suggest that limber pine was once more abundant at lower elevations. Oh, I'm seeing audio trouble. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you
You is
clearly from here.
fine for me.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for confirming. Monahan et al. Noted that limber pine is known to be in the alpine treeline ecotone already, but also that its distribution and relative abundance there remains unclear. And they also acknowledge that the seedling niche differs from that of the adult tree. While limber pine recruitment has been documented to be widespread in Rocky Mount National Park at lower elevations and subalpine forest, it is unclear whether recruitment is occurring at higher elevations and at what frequency. And while bioclimatic envelope models are an indispensable step in predicting what will happen with species distributions under changing climate, they do have other limitations. So it's also unclear whether they're the best choice for a generalist species like limber pine, which has a broad climatic envelope. Limber pine is also a very slow-growing and long-lived species whose distribution is thought to be a relict of past climates. Mature trees can tolerate a broad amplitude of climate conditions, whereas seedling niches are narrower. In the harsh alpine treeline ecotone, seedlings may require shelter from nurse objects and several years of prolonged moisture to establish. So when I was just beginning my PhD in 2017, these first two papers had recently come out, showing that limber pine was establishing in the alpine treeline ecotone in the White Mountains of California at higher elevations than Great Basin bristlecone pine. The White Mountains are more arid even than the Colorado Front Range, so this seemed further indication that limber pine could migrate to higher elevations under changing climate, even as water stress becomes worse. How rude of me, I should have defined this earlier. So I decided to study limber pine in the alpine treeline ecotone. So that's the transitional zone between the timberline, the limit of upright tree growth, and treeline, the limit of all tree growth. This ecotone is a mosaic of alpine tundra plants, bare mineral soil, rocks, and trees, which often grow in a Krumholtz form, a stunted mat-like growth form. Treeline is primarily controlled by temperature, but in general, you can expect harsh conditions in these regions year-round, including high solar radiation, short growing seasons, poor soils, high wind speeds, seasonally high soil temperatures, and low average temperatures year-round. So for treeline to advance by our definition, you only need trees to establish above the existing treeline. However, for community development, facilitation is really important. Generally speaking, as abiotic stress increases in a system, competitive interactions give way to facilitative interactions. Trees tend to establish in protected microsites, leeward or downwind of boulders or other trees called nurse objects. These objects provide wind shelter and shade, reduce nighttime sky exposure. They absorb solar radiation and re-radiate that energy as heat into nearby soil. And then they also slow wind speed, so they trap snow and sediment in their lee, encouraging soil development. They may also trap seeds this way for wind-dispersed species. So as trees establish and grow, they begin to create leeward microsites of their own, facilitate facilitating the establishment of seedlings downwind, and then ultimately forming tree islands. So based on this hypothesis, we can identify functional or ecological roles. Tree island initiators are the most windward tree in tree islands, sheltering the downwind trees. Tree island components are a part of tree islands. Satellite trees are downwind of a sheltering tree, but without overlapping canopies. And then solitary trees are separate from any other tree. They have no facilitative benefit from other species, though they may still be downwind of a nurse rock. So Dr. Diana Tombach and colleagues have documented the importance of whitebark pine as a tree island initiator, able to establish as a solitary tree and facilitate other trees downwind. In fact, Jill Pyatt used micro-weather stations to demonstrate that whitebark pine and other conifers provide better shelter than rocks, and also found that seedling survival was highest leeward of whitebark pine. So this really begs the question whether limber pine could function similarly in treeline communities. We sought to survey treeline communities to evaluate where limber pine is found at treeline versus subalpine forest, where its distribution is mapped. What limber pine is doing in those communities in terms of functional role, and to estimate recruitment in treeline communities in the Southern Rocky Mountains, both overall and by species. We wanted to chip away at the uncertainty regarding limber pine's response to climate change in these high elevation sites. So we're located in Denver, Colorado, and we have the benefit of Rocky Mount National Park nearby, which includes vast regions above 11,000 feet in elevation, which is the approximate tree line in this elevation in this region. The park features an extensive trail system that allows reasonable access to treeline communities over the entire park. So subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce are ubiquitous, shown in yellow across the map here. Limber pine, on the other hand, has a patchy distribution that forms a metapopulation. It's in green, connected by directed seed dispersal by Clark's nutcrackers. And the park is bifurcated by the continental divide. As moist air is lifted up and over the divide, precipitation falls primarily in the west side, leading to higher moisture, and then drier air moves over to the east side with less precipitation, creating a rain shadow effect. Notice that drought-tolerant limber pine is found mostly on the east side of the park. So because of limber pine's patchy distribution, we stratified our sampling by proximity to subalpine limber pine. We used a 3,000 meter buffer around subalpine limber pine polygons as a typical nutcracker caching distance, and then intersected this buffer with a buffer of 750 meters around trails and roads for reasonable hiking access off trail. And then we generated 25 random points. We eliminated sites that were unsafe with a combination of Google Earth Pro and then scouting on the ground. Created rough study area polygons, divided the areas by aspect, and then generated a random point in each aspect. So we established 1 to 3 quadrats per study site at each random point. And ultimately, this resulted in 37 community quadrats at 19 study sites. So there are 9 sites west of the Continental Divide and 10 sites east of the Continental Divide. Our definition of alpine treeline ecotone, again, was between timberline, upright tree growth, and treeline, the upper limit of all tree growth. So we located random points with a Trimble geolocator in the field and then established square quadrats based on randomly generated directions. We surveyed the entire quadrat for any tree from newly established seedlings like germinants up to mature trees. And we recorded the GPS center point of each tree, as well as the species, length, width, height, and ecological role. You can see that some of these sites were quite easy to navigate. This was the Battle Mountain site. And other sites were pretty difficult to access and to demarcate quadrats because of the steepness of the terrain and the rockiness. Limber pine was found only in quadrats on the east side of the Continental Divide in the rain shadow. In some communities, it was a very minor component, only 7.4%. And in other communities, it was almost the entire community at 97.6%. In contrast, Engelmann spruce was the most abundant on either side of the divide and was in most cases and was present in every quadrat. Subalpine fir varied from 0 to 80% on the west side of the divide and was a typical component east of the divide as well. Very occasionally, we did find some lodgepole pine. So limber pine's relative abundance in treeline communities was strongly related to proximity to subalpine seed sources. We did not find any limber pine in treeline communities further than 3,000 meters from subalpine seed sources. And in contrast, there was no relationship for wind-dispersed spruce and fir. As far as ecological roles in these communities, these figures show mean proportions of tree species in each role. So the error bars show 95% confidence intervals around the means. We can see that limber pine and Engelmann spruce were the most abundant solitary trees east of the divide. And limber pine, which is the dark green, tended to occur more as a satellite or solitary tree, these two, than as an island component or a windward species. So it tended to occur by itself rather than as a part of tree islands. The same is the case for Engelmann spruce west of the divide, interestingly. We also did an odds ratio analysis. So the odds of something happening is the probability of that thing occurring over the probability of it not occurring. And an odds ratio is the odds of one event happening divided by the odds of another event happening. So then if the odds ratio is equal to 1, then there's no difference in the odds. In this case, if the confidence interval for the odds ratio is entirely above the 1 line, that means the odds of the species being in the windward position is significantly greater than its odds of being solitary or present at the site. So you have solitary in panel A and overall abundance at the site in panel B. We found that limber pine occupies the windward position significantly less often than its relative abundance at study sites would suggest. So limber pine is the purple here. So it's abundant as a solitary and satellite tree, but it doesn't tend to form tree islands as often. Oddly enough, subalpine fir stands out as a tree island initiator significantly more often than we would predict from its relative abundance. East of the divide, the same is true for Engelmann spruce. So why is limber pine not functioning as a tree island initiator, given its prevalence as a solitary tree? Well, limber pine is either occupying sites where spruce and fir can't establish, or perhaps it doesn't provide adequate shelter due to differences in its growth form, as compared to spruce and fir, or as shown here, whitebark pine. All of those species form Krummholz mats, whereas limber pine either grows prostrate along the ground, or sometimes has more of like a shrub-like growth form, which can facilitate the establishment of trees downwind. Though, as we saw, not significantly, or significantly less often than we might expect, given how abundant it is at a site. Yeah, let's see. So while the reason is untested, we can say limber pine functions differently in ATE communities than whitebark pine. It's abundant as a solitary tree, but it doesn't often facilitate the establishment of other conifers. So we would expect treeline communities with limber pine to look quite different in structure and composition than treeline communities with whitebark pine or other species. Both whitebark and limber pine might lead treeline advance, given that they can establish as a solitary tree, likely in part because of that directed dispersal by Clark's nutcrackers. But the communities will be quite different. So make sure you catch Diana's talk at the upcoming Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation conference next month. We also have a paper under review at Ecosphere on this topic. So limber pine is also primarily distributed in the arid systems east of the Continental Divide and the rain shadow, and is most abundant at treeline where a subalpine seed source is nearby. Okay, so we know limber pine is abundant as a solitary tree and that its treeline distribution is determined primarily by subalpine seed sources. So let's take a look at regeneration. The reproduction limitation hypothesis is that tree line position is limited by viable seed production, dispersal to higher elevations, and seedling niche requirements, which vary among species. For example, we see primarily 3 species at treeline in the southern Rocky Mountains, and the seedlings of these species have very different niche requirements. For all species, establishment tends to be episodic with periods of higher precipitation. However, Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, they are ubiquitous at treeline, tend to co-occur. We covered that. These conifers are susceptible to low temperature photoinhibition and benefit more from shelter than limber pine. They also require high moisture to establish and tend to be found in moist microsites with persistent snowpack. By contrast, limber pine seedlings have a rounded, dense crown that retains heat. The seedlings are relatively drought tolerant in that they devote early resources to the development of a taproot. They have large stomata and high stomatal density, which could lead to water loss, except that they also modulate their photosynthetic activity throughout the year, like we mentioned earlier. So limber pine seedlings can leverage earlier snowmelt with higher rates of photosynthesis and early bud burst, supported by rapid CO2 intake through those large stomata, and then reduce photosynthesis in the summer. We found that they can survive. We've established that they can survive and establish a tree line without facilitation from other conifers, and have that benefit of directed dispersal. So we were not allowed to destructively sample seedlings in designated wilderness in the national park, but we did have the benefit of a recent study by Bailey et al. In the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, also in the Southern Rockies, where a relative of limber pine, Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, is found. They did destructively sample seedlings using a 1 meter height threshold. And they found that most of the seedlings were 16 to 21 years old, with a few bristlecone pine trees that were much older, like 45 to 75 years old, that were misclassified as regeneration. So these figures show the distribution of tree heights across our sites, as well as broken down by 2 thresholds. So we decided to apply their 1 meter threshold, as well as a more conservative 20 centimeter threshold. So those are the blue and red lines respectively. And then these are the histograms of heights in those 2 categories across sites. So as many others have found at treeline elsewhere, tree regeneration was generally very low, hovering near 0 seedlings in most quadrats, with a median of 3 recruits in the 20 centimeter category and 10 in the 100 centimeter category. On the left in green, we have total regeneration at sites east of the divide and total regeneration west of the divide. And then in purple, we have limber pine dominated communities, so greater than 50% limber pine. On the east side of the divide, limber pine again is only found east of the divide in the park. Well, for the most part, at tree line, based on our findings, like based on our sampled sites. And then in brown, we have spruce fir dominated communities east of the divide. And so this is the 20 centimeter category and the 100 centimeter category. So you can see that we have some exceptions of quadrats with higher regeneration west of the divide, and in limber pine dominated communities east of the divide, but generally regeneration was pretty low across the board. Here we're looking at mean relative abundances across quadrats for each species, with the error bars showing 95% confidence intervals. So west of the divide, and the bottom here, you can see that regeneration is significantly higher for Engelmann spruce than subalpine fir, with occasional degenerate lodgepole pine trees. We can think of the 20 centimeter and 100 centimeter categories as bracketing more recent and longer histories of establishment at the sites, although of course we don't have precise ages without destructive sampling, which you don't really want to do. We don't see a shift in species composition between these categories west of the divide. It's about the same between the two. East of the divide, we again don't see significant shifts in regeneration for subalpine fir or Engelmann spruce, but we do see some interesting patterns for limber pine. In the 100 centimeter category, we can see a significantly greater proportion of limber pine as regeneration rather than established, indicating a shift in relative abundance over the last 30 to 70 years, based on that Bailey et al. Data. And limber pine regeneration is also higher than for other conifers, though this is only significant for the 100 centimeter category compared to subalpine fir. However, the significant increase is really driven by just a few quadrats at 2 study sites where limber pine is most abundant. These sites have lower summer precipitation and moderate to high climate water deficit in the summer and fall. We also used PRISM data, so that's parameter elevation regressions on independent slopes model data. It's interpolated climate model data with adjustments for slope and topography, modeling effects such as cold air pooling and valley bottoms. And it's the highest resolution data available for these high elevation sites. That also accounts for relationships with elevation and slope, which is really important in mountainous regions. We found the expected increase in temperature of about 1 degree Celsius over the last 30 years across all seasons. And while overall snowpack hasn't changed over the last 30 years, we have seen earlier snowmelt due to those high spring temperatures, which in combination with gradually declining summer precipitation has led to steadily increasing summer and fall climate water deficit. So climate water deficit is the difference between potential evapotranspiration under conditions of no water limitation and actual evapotranspiration where water intake is limited. We saw an increase in summer and fall climate water deficit. It appears to be, we have the east of the divide, all the sites east of the divide in orange and west of the divide in purple. And it appears the increase in climate water deficit appears to be happening faster for sites east of the continental divide in the rain shadow. But comparing sites dominated by spruce and fir to those dominated by limber pine, we didn't find significant differences in terms of our PRISM climate variables. Summer precipitation was slightly lower in limber pine dominated communities in blue here, east of the divide than west, there's greater variability, but not significantly so, and there's greater variability east of the divide than west. In general, this is consistent with expectations for limber pine as a generalist species, that we're not seeing huge differences, can tolerate a range of conditions. There's also possibly lower May snowpack where limber pine is dominant, indicating earlier snowmelt, but again, this is not significant. We're very limited in terms of the spatial and temporal resolution of these PRISM data, as high as they are, as the best quality that we can get, but it's still not the same as maybe deploying micro weather stations, which would be interesting. So while we see differences in regeneration rates between species, we're really seeing a decline in available moisture across sites, especially east of the divide during the growing season. And we're not seeing many differences between communities with different compositions in terms of those climate variables. While we are seeing that limber pine is able to regenerate more often east of the divide. So to summarize, we found low regeneration at all sites in our 625 square meter quadrats. The sites with higher regeneration were either west of the divide, where treeline systems have low summer and fall climate water deficit, relatively speaking, or east of the divide in communities dominated by limber pine. And at these sites, we're also seeing a slight increase in limber pine over the last 30 to 70 years. So we probably had a pulse of recruitment. Another of our studies Oh, yeah, no. Another of our studies showed that the Battle Mountain site, which had the highest regeneration, also had the highest rates of viable seed production among studied treeline sites. So overall, we believe our work indicates moisture limitation in these systems for treeline advance and for recruitment into the ATE, which limber pine may periodically overcome more frequently than Engelmann spruce or subalpine fir. Though this really merits a range-wide study for limber pine, because of course, as time-consuming as it is to visit all those sites in Rocky Mountain National Park, it's still a geographically limited area. So predictions of tree line movement must consider differences in species tolerances, especially at the seedling stage, and whether tree line shifts and the pace of tree line movement will depend on whether seedlings can tolerate changes in conditions, and at what frequency, as well as the pace of growth and maturation. So this is assuming, of course, that the first hurdle of viable seed dispersal to protected microsites occurs. More arid tree lines will be more likely to advance where limber pine is abundant. This merits greater study of limber pine at tree line range wide. Limber pine may have a patchy distribution and it's not as ubiquitous as Engelmann spruce or subalpine fir in the Southern Rockies, but it does dominate tree line sites in many locations, especially east of the Continental Divide. These are just some examples of other locations I've visited, although not collected data at. And as I mentioned, the site with the highest regeneration also had the highest rates of viable seed production. However, unfortunately, no story of limber pine is complete without considering the impacts of white pine blister rust. So in the absence of blister rust, limber pine seems well suited to track climate and is in fact establishing in these high elevation sites. It is also producing cones and viable seeds there. But blister rust is infecting trees at these high elevation sites as well. I was the first to identify white pine blister rust at treeline sites in Rocky Mountain National Park in 2019. And I've found blister rust at additional treeline sites in the park since. More recently, I've also found widespread infections at treeline in limber pine on Niwot Mountain, Niwot Ridge, and Mount Audubon. So it's clear that while these high elevation sites might be climate refugia for limber pine, they are not refugia from white pine blister rust, which unfortunately appears to be spreading quickly through these treeline sites. So that said, I'd like to thank my committee members, collaborators, and many, many research assistants I've been lucky to work with over the years. Thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions. There's a question from Michael here. What were the limber pine regenerating from? I'm not sure I understand the question. We're talking about the establishment of new limber pine seedlings in alpine treeline ecotone communities. So the seed source could be from other trees in the alpine treeline ecotone, because limber pine is producing cones and viable seeds there. Or it could be that the seeds are from subalpine forest and are due to nutcracker caching upslope. Maybe that answers the question. Thanks, everybody. My apologies for not defining regeneration up front. I'll be sure to do that in the future. the share.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for that great presentation.
Thanks, Lynn.
We can open up the opportunity for our attendants, as you all already are, to ask and share any comments or questions. We have about 20 minutes left. So go ahead and type your questions or comments into the chat. I am going to venture to guess that we will have enough time to go over all of the questions, but if we do not, don't worry, our team will send them out to Laurel with your contact information for further discussion.
Thanks, Lou. I see a question from Mandy. Do you think your work will help inform planting practices? That's a good question. And it might be worth considering assisted migration for limber pine to higher elevations, but the survival of seedlings at high elevation sites is typically much lower. So I'm not sure that we would get the greatest bang for our buck with restoration that way, given that so much money needs to go into identifying rust-resistant seed sources, and then raising seedlings in the greenhouses or doing direct seeding. All of that work is incredibly time-consuming and really expensive. So I would guess that that's not going to be a focus. However, it is somewhat hopeful that nutcrackers do cache at these high elevation sites. Limber pine won't be competing for water resources as much as in subalpine forest, and temperatures will be slightly lower. So it's possible that these sites will be climate refugia, but I doubt that they'll be targets for restoration planting. But that's a great question.
Thanks, Laurel. There is another question in the chat from Zoe about how high tree line generally is in the Rocky Mountains.
So it varies, but it's typically around 11,000 feet. It's higher west of the divide, and I think it's a little higher further south, although that also depends on moisture. It can be lower on the east side of the divide, like below, slightly below 11,000 feet, but it's generally in that neighborhood. The alpine treeline ecotone can start as low as, I've seen it start as low as 10,250 feet or so, in terms of like the timberline. And that also depends on topography and whether like there's a lot of wind exposure, for example. And like if the mountains are funneling winds at higher speeds through a pass, for example. Let's see. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. There's another question in the chat from Dr. Tomback, wondering if more work on suitable microsites would be helpful for restoration planting and seeding given climate warming.
That's a great question, Diana, and I would say so. I know I volunteered with Boulder County Parks and Rec, and I know their restoration planting efforts definitely take nurse objects into account. I also helped plant some seedlings in Rocky Mount National Park, and their teams are very conscientious about either planting downwind of nurse objects or even creating nurse objects to shelter the seedlings. But yeah, I think consideration for suitable microsites, especially for like retention of snowpack to some degree, because seedlings do have higher survival rates when there's moisture early in their lives, even if they're relatively drought tolerant compared to other species, and then shelters from wind and sky exposure. yeah, with climate warming, I would say that that's an important consideration.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, and great question, Dr. Tomback. I have a couple other questions for you while we're waiting for more questions to roll into the chat. And we have plenty of time, so if you do have a question, please definitely feel free to put it in the chat. From the webinar team, we are wondering, given limber pine treeline advance, should we be concerned about misidentifying limber and whitebark pine cones? And is there anything in place for research purposes in places where genetic testing is particularly important?
I'm sorry, I was responding to a comment. Could you repeat that?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry about that. We, as a webinar team, were wondering earlier in the conversation if there should be any concern about misidentifying whitebark and limber pine with the movement of limber pine treeline advance.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so like in regions of the country where the distributions overlap, like whether
Yes.
You said whether we should be concerned.
Concerned, yeah. If there are any implementations in place already to prevent misidentification from happening.
So the best way to distinguish them is based on cones. They are very, very similar, so it can be tricky to distinguish those species in the fields without the presence of cones. However, I guess in terms of tree line advance, if you were trying to test the question of whether a community dominated by one or the other species has a different structure and composition as a result of the ecological role or function of those species, you would want to be pretty sure about your identification there. But I think otherwise, I don't know that it would be hugely concerning. In some areas, whitebark pine establishes it as a solitary tree, but does not actually act as a tree island initiator. And I think more research is needed to really tease apart what abiotic factors predict that. But generally speaking, it has been found to function as a tree island initiator and facilitate the establishment of other seedlings with greater frequency, whereas limber pine definitely doesn't seem to be doing that. Oh, and yeah, so were you talking about seedlings or the mature trees? Because Diana made the good point that genetics is the only way to ID seedlings.
I think our question was in terms of any trees that are not producing cones, whether that be mature trees that aren't producing cones or seedlings that aren't.
Okay, yeah. And John Van Gundy asked whether spectroscopy would help. I am very skeptical that it's possible that hyperspectral data at really high resolution, like at the resolution achievable with a drone, it's possible that it could distinguish those species, but I'm quite skeptical that that would be possible with remote sensing methods because the trees are frequently so similar. It's possible that I think if you were to time it with masting, then you might be able to detect some differences. And it's also possible that if you had multiple time points for the same area, that with earlier bud burst with limber pine, with respect to whitebark pine, that you could maybe capture, you could maybe distinguish those species based on their phenology. But I suspect that you would need both high temporal resolution, you would need high temporal resolution, spatial resolution, and spectral resolution because these species are so similar. genetics would be more reliable, I would say. But no one has tried that to my knowledge. So it would be really interesting if somebody wants to do it. Let's see. I'm reading Jesse Logan's comment here. Comparing limber to whitebark pine in areas of overlap, many of the same issues, but the distribution of limber seems less restricted by competition with other conifers than whitebark. Would you care to comment? So limber pine does co-occur with at least 22 different overstory species. And it does have a wider, it occupies a wider range of elevations and soil types than whitebark pine. However, it is still really slow growing. So it's not going to compete as well as faster growing conifers that are able to grow faster and take in moisture faster and compete for moisture and nutrients as a result. So I would say that they're similar in terms of their competitive ability, based on what I've read. But limber pine can tolerate a wider range of climate conditions and soil conditions.
Great. Thank you, Laurel, for answering all of those questions. I will give it a minute or two just to see if any other questions pop up into the chat. And then if nothing does, we'll go ahead and wrap things up.
Thank you, Lou.
Yeah, thank you. Given that no additional comments have popped up, except for that limber pine is really the coolest tree species, I think we all agree. That's a great comment. On behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, I want to thank Laura again for your participation. Our next webinar series will be on October 21st, and we will share details regarding that webinar as soon as we can. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for our upcoming installments. And for those of you all attending the conference, many of us look forward to seeing you all there.
Yay, thank you, everybody.